Let's now call Audi, who is the final speaker on the proposition side from National Junior College, to conclude the case and summarize for the prop.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, as the healthcare providers, we have three main areas of concern. Firstly, that of the problems with status quo. Secondly, that of the needs of the young. And thirdly, the problem of the aging population and how best to prevent it. Now, first, let me go on to the point on the problem with status quo. Now, the opposition has told us that the elderly's needs have been taken care of because we have funds, we have subsidies, we have plans put in place to help them. But that is... Well, we do agree that that is the case, but that's not what we're debating about. The point here is that we have to show that the elderly's needs must take precedence. And just proving that the elderly's needs haven't been covered does not really show that. Because the truth is, for the young, the case still applies. We said that the young's needs have in fact been even more fulfilled. We see that right now, we're sitting in this room, we have an auditorium, we have schools, we have running tracks, and elderly, some of them, as we've already proven to you in our case, there are loopholes in the shields and the funds. And we see that some of them are even struggling to meet their most basic physiological needs, like food, like water, like shelter, while we, on the other hand, have education, have schools. And yes, we do recognize that it is a need, but we see that the elderly's needs are of greater importance and therefore should take precedence. Now, on to my next point, that of the needs of the young. Now, the opposition has told us that because they will lead us to a brighter future, because they will benefit the economy, and that's why their needs should take precedence, not the elderly's. But, ladies and gentlemen, is that really what we want to debate about today? No, we are taking what the young's needs are and the elderly's needs are, and then taking it both into consideration, making a fair comparison, which is more pressing, which is more urgent, and which the government should turn to address first. And that is what we need to focus on for today, not whether they will lead us to a brighter future and benefit the economy or not. Are you saying that we're just going to take into account those that are going to benefit us in the long run and just ignore the entire sector of society just because you're not as productive, just because you're not as effective in work as the young? No, we see that even the elderly is part of the society, and this is a democracy. Singapore is a democracy. When you vote and elect government into power, you're placing a responsibility, a trust, and an obligation for them to take care of every member of society. That is the mandate and duty of the government. And therefore, it is not just the young's needs that you have to pay attention to. Just because they contribute to the economy, that doesn't mean that they should take precedence over the elderly. Thirdly, let me move on to that other problem with the aging population. Now, the aging population is something that the opposition has brought up continuously during this debate, but allow me to show you that that is also not what we're discussing for today. Just because there's a problem of aging population.
Point, madam.
Yes, ma'am.
But we see by solving the problem of the aging population, we are actually working towards greater social stability.
Just because we're working towards a better economy, that doesn't show that we should give precedence to the young instead of the elderly. We should look at whose needs, because as I've already proven to you before, just because they contribute more, that doesn't mean that they should take precedence. We should not neglect and ignore any sector of society, including the elderly. And we see that, in fact, their need is more pressing, their need is more urgent because it concerns very basic needs that we already have, as the opposition has already mentioned, parents to take care of. And that brings us to our next point, that of parents being able to take care of children. Now, as you can see, in a society, we have a sharing of burden for children and young by the parents and the government, and that means that the parents are able to take the responsibility and impartial take care of the young, their most basic needs, their food, their water, as I would assume that a very large majority of us are going through right now. And that means that there's less reliance and dependence on the government to provide such schemes, such subsidies to relieve a financial burden. But this, we see, is not the case for the elderly. In fact, it's rather the reverse. We see that a lot of them, their families are unable or unwilling, as for reasons that my first speaker has already mentioned. For example, they do not have the financial ability to, or they do not know how to. And other such problems can also occur. And we see that because of this, the elderly actually needs the government to come into place and provide schemes and subsidies to help them through these financial difficulties. And that is why we see that there's a more pressing need for the needs of the elderly to take precedence over the young, because the young already has the parents to take care of it. But you see the elderly are left alone to support themselves, and many of them have been put into homes or to have even one-room apartments and studio flats, as the opposition has already mentioned, and they have to support themselves. They have to make ends meet. They have to fulfill their basic needs, something that we have seen such schemes like the Elder Shield and the Elder Fund not always coming into place, and therefore we see that their needs more pressing. As I've shown you, we have not taken just the young's needs and the elder's needs into account. We've also shown you why the elderly's needs should take precedence. Hence, we go with our side of the house.
Finally, I call Amaris of Methodist Girls' School to conclude the case and to summarize for the opposition side.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we see today is that the goal of us, this party, the parents, is aligned with the state goals, because at the end of the day, what we want is a better future for our children, a better world and a better Singapore for our children to live in. So with this, let me go on to my two main points of contentions. The first on what is best for Singapore, and the second on what the government's duty is in all of this. But before that, let's clear up an issue here. Now, the second proposition came up here today to say that, precedence is showing that the elderly's needs are important. And while we do agree they're important, what we say the motion means here is that the extra surpluses in the Singapore budget should be allocated to the young. We're not going to touch the status quo. We agree that the allocation of funds in the status quo is fine, that the young are covered enough, that the young are covered and the elderly are covered. What we're saying is that the extra surpluses, the extra budget should go to cover the young for reasons that our side has explained many times. Furthermore, what we're going to say is that today, they've come up here today to constantly argue that the elderly in the status quo aren't taken care of. But let's look at the many measures my side has already brought up. We've brought up MediSave, we've brought up Elder Shield, and on top of that, we have measures such as CPF. But let's look at the additional measures. For example, the Ministry of Manpower, the SNEF, and NTUC have a tripartite committee on the employability of older workers. And with this, 4,000 more elderly were employed. And so we see that the government is working with all these other parties to help the elderly, and that there's no need for all these extra surpluses in the budget to go to the elderly. And what we see is that the pressing need in society right now is not so much the elderly, but the problem of our low birth rate. And so we see that, as my first speaker has already brought up, the solution to this is to pump more money into measures such as the baby bonus, and that this will bring about long-term benefits. So with this, let me go on to my point on what is best for Singapore. Is it the short-term solution that the proposition has painted out today, or is it the long-term solution that my side of the house is bringing you today? Now what we see is that the Prop 1 came up today to say that we want funds and programs for the elderly, and the Op 1 responded by saying that when we give more precedence to the young, what this leads to is more jobs and a better economy. Then the Prop 2 came up to say that the economy doesn't really matter. We should still take care of the elderly no matter what. But let's look at this. Like the long-term solution to the problem of over-reliance right now, to the problem of an aging population, is through putting precedence on the young, because we see that how the elderly will be reliant and self-reliant is when they have good jobs. Now, for them to have good jobs, what they need to do is to have a good education. And so what we see is, because the main bulk of their CPF comes from having from the job, from having a high salary. This comes from having a good job, which essentially boils down to education. And so we see that what happens is that what we want is that when our present young become old, we don't want them to face the same problems that the elderly may be facing today, as you said. And so what we see is that the long-term solution is to educate, is to have the baby bonus schemes in order that there'll be less reliance in the future, and that this will be better for Singapore. Secondly, what we see is that there'll be less reliant on the working population. And so all the problems right now that you state will not be about. Now what we see is that, secondly, the government's role in society, as all parties have agreed now, is to have a duty of care. But let's look at how the government should work. Now we see that the government has to operate by a utilitarianism policy, that they have to prioritize the needs based on the long-term benefit and based on what benefits the most people. And what we see is that taking looking at the young and, putting more money into the baby bonus will lead to more fresh blood, and this will lead to a bigger talent pool in Singapore. This will lead to more people taking up all these jobs in the economy, to a more diversified and a more vibrant economy, and this is what will bring Singapore on par with the rest of the world and with the rest of Asia. And so what we see is that in the long term, what benefits Singapore is actually the whole idea of taking precedence of the young. Now, secondly, what we see is that the Prop 2 has come up here with the whole idea of democracy, and to say that the elders, should be listened to. But what we see is that it's the children you should listen to, because they have no say in society. And the last bastion of hope for them is their parents to represent them. And we see that even if all else fails, we see that democracy is just a means to an end, which is the best for the state. And we see that prioritizing the young leads to upward mobility, leads to a better economy. And hence we see that you should go with our side of the house.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this debate, and the judges will now leave the room to deliberate and be back with us in about 1 to 2 minutes.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations to all the speakers on the stage today. We thought that both sides put up a very good fight, a very engaging debate in what we thought was actually quite a very difficult topic with philosophical undertones to it, which actually we felt that philosophical part could have been brought out a bit more and fleshed out, but we did feel that all sides put in a very good case, which was actually very well prepared and with some very good examples. But ultimately, what we felt was that the winning team was the one who managed to better articulate the fact that the fact that the key operative term here would be the word over. So I think that from the start of the debate, both sides did put up a case in which you tried to outline that you're not just looking at the needs of the elderly or the needs of the young, but you're in fact looking at both. But we felt that throughout the debate, it did somewhat degenerate into some kinds of overexertions into your own side as opposed to the other. So ultimately, the winning team was the one who better articulated the fact that your side should take precedence over the other and fleshed it out with well-supported examples and good rebuttals to the other team. Okay, yeah, so I'll leave it to them to announce the winner.
And it gives me great pleasure to announce that the second opposition team won today's debate.